Hello and welcome to this CarTV tutorial. Now I wanted to make a quick tutorial about how to indent your code properly. Now I know that this is not something that will come easy to some of you who just started scripting Scar, but it's very important because it adds to the readability of your code, so it will be easier for other people to read your code if you indent it properly. Now I've got a new script open here. And the first thing you should note is that you have kind of blocks of code, and these are usually surrounded by the begin and end tags. So this is basically a block of code. So anything you put in here, for example a write line, this is still the block of code. So you can basically put anything in between that. Another thing, for example, if you have an if statement, this will always validate as true, of course. This is basically a block of code, but if you add something after it will no longer be part of the if statement. So the thing about indentation that you need to know first is that in Delphi, or well, in this case in Scar, which is uses Pascal, which is Delphi is derived from it, so you basically want to indent with 2 spaces. So in front of every statement you want at least 2 spaces. Now the reason for this is that basically if you put everything on the same line, and I'm going to quickly demonstrate that. So if you put everything on the same line, it becomes kind of a jumble of stuff that will become hard to read if you've got a lot of code. So what you want to do is indent every code block. So in this case, the begin and end are basically the root of your indentation. So they should be to the far left. Now after that, all of the stuff in between the begin and end should be indented by 1. So we indent that. You can select it and press Shift, or you can press Control Shift Insert. And before I meant Tab actually. So you press Tab or Control Shift I, which is Insert. And if you want to remove an indentation, you press Control Shift U. So we've basically got our stuff in between begin and end indented now. And the next thing we want to do is indent the code blocks inside of that. Now in this case we don't have a begin and an end, but write line is basically, this write line here is the code block that follows the if then statement. So we have to indent that as well. And as you can see, your code becomes a lot clearer because you know that everything that happens in the begin and end statement will be indented to the right by 1. Everything that happens inside of this if statement will also be indented again. So for example, if we put a begin and end here, we don't have to indent those because they form the code block for the if statement, but now everything in between them also has to be indented. Now this is completely a useless code block, but I guess you could use it to somewhat differentiate in your code. So again, begin and end statement, so everything in between this should also be indented. The same thing is also true for loops, for example a repeat until statement. So everything in between here again has to be indented. Same also for a while loop, but as you know, while basically requires a begin and end statement. So change that to false. So unless of course you want just one line, then you can drop those, but it's the same. So you have to indent there as well. Now other things that are a bit trickier, for example, are case statements. Now I'm going to make a quick variable here. So also variables need indentation. unless you put it on the same line, of course. So in this case, you can just drop the variable behind the var keyword. If you put it below that, you should indent, and if you have multiple variables, you should, well, certainly on multiple lines, you should definitely do this, unless you use the var keyword multiple times, but that doesn't really look that good. So this is basically the best way of doing that. Constant statements, types should all be indented just the same. So for example, to make a quick detour, if you want to define a record type, I'm going to call T record. You also need to indent the stuff in this kind of code block here. So to get back to our case statements, I'm going to remove that there. Let's say we assign a value 5 to int. Then if we set up our case statements, if int, so case int of, that's basically a code block. And now this, you kind of have to look at that, how you do it. It kind of depends on your programming style. For the cases themselves, you can either put them on the same line, then do something like this. I prefer to just indent all of that. So, well, you could also, for example, put it on the same line and then indent the begin end. But as I said, I prefer to do it like this. So that's how you indent case statements, basically. So the else should be indented the same as the numbers. So, well, that's for case statements, and well, that's actually basically everything I can think of. So at this time I have not yet set up a scripting standards guide for Scar. I will try to come up with one later on, but do note that the scripting standards that you use yourself will adapt over time to the way you program. So they're actually more like guidelines than rules about scripting. So you kind of have to find your own way in this, but this should give you an idea of basic indenting, which is really a requirement if you're going to write a lot of code.